All right, if everyone could just take their seats, we'll get the last panel started. All right, so I'm Jill Rook. I'm from the Great Plains Institute, and I'm going to introduce and moderate this last panel for you called Bringing Decarbonized Electricity to Transportation. So far, this event is focused on opportunities and strategies for decarbonizing the electric sector. There's a strong interest today in the beneficial electrification of other sectors as this electric sector decarbonizes. And transportation is likely to be the biggest opportunity of that kind. Obviously, there is a big role in this in collaboration with other stakeholders. MTech, the Midcontinent Transportation Electrification Collaborative, was established in spring 2017 in order to better understand this opportunity and chart a path forward for the Midcontinent region. It's also important to note that this past April, MTech did recently release their first publication focused on the electric utility sector and their roles in the electric vehicle market. So this panel will work to expand on what decarbonization in the transportation sector looks like and what needs to be done in order to expand what this will look like in the Midcontinent region. So before me, I have three panelists. Nearest to me is Charles Griffith, who is the Climate and Energy Program Director at the Ecology Center. He has worked for more than 20 years in research and advocacy on clean energy solutions. He has served on a variety of state and federal level energy and climate-related projects. He also serves as the board chair for the Ann Arbor Area Transportation Authority and is the co-convener of M-TEC. Next, we have Michael Krauthamer, who is the senior advisor for Alliance for Transportation Electrification. Along with promoting the organization's mission, he also advises a wide range of industry stakeholders on business development and strategy for implementing EV charging that is commercially viable. Prior to his current role, he was an executive at NRG Energy's EVgo, and he has also served as the executive policy advisor to the Maryland Policy Service Commission and as an attorney at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And finally, we have Kevin Miller, who is the Director of Public Policy at ChargePoint. He works throughout the Northeast and Midwest to overcome legislative and regulatory barriers to transportation electrification. Before his current role, he served as Chief Financial Officer for the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs in Massachusetts, and has also served in a variety of roles in state agencies, legislators, and campaigns. So, Charles, you want to take it off?
Sure, thank you. Well, there's a lot of hazards of being the last panel of the day, but I thank you all for sticking around. And I was originally going to give Patrice a hard time about having started off with those questions about EVs and how we can deal with them with the earlier panel, but I think I'm going to just give her credit for whetting your appetite for this perhaps more in-depth discussion on this panel. So thanks, Patrice, and thanks to the earlier panel who started some good discussion about this topic. Yes, the Ecology Center where I'm from, we work on a range of environmental issues, and I have been taking responsibility in the energy and climate field. I've spent a lot of my career working on the transportation side of things, including this kind of new area of electric vehicles and trying to figure out what policies can best move us forward and resolve challenges to that new market. One of the things that we have started convening over the last couple of years is a broader regional collaborative that we call the Charge Up Midwest, and it's made up of other environmental NGOs and clean transportation organizations throughout the Midwest, and we've been, working with a range of stakeholders in our work and in our respective states, and we collaborated with GPI and the Midwest Power Sector, or the Midcontinent Power Sector Collaborative, to create this MTech collaboration as Jill mentioned, in the last year or so. Part of the reason that we had to do this as a spin-off group is that we really, when you start delving into transportation issues, you need other transportation-related organizations to be engaged in that effort. And so while we have some of the same NGO and utility players in that table, we also now have automakers. We have some of the transportation or the electric vehicle charging suppliers and other national experts on these issues in the field engaged with us. So we're really thankful to have this group to engage on these issues here in our region. MTech has started working on a range of projects, but one of the first ones that we got together on to develop was this white paper on electric utility roles in the electric vehicle market, and this effort to try to develop some consensus principles that could help provide guidance to states and utilities in our region as they grapple with these issues. So we're proud of this effort, and as Jill mentioned, this white paper we put out in April was our first big collaboration to try to come together across all these stakeholders on this broader regional venue. So what I'm going to do is talk about some of the key findings from that report, and then introduce the principles, and then turn it to my colleagues here to sort of go into more in depth on some examples of where this is playing out in the region and across the country, and some of the, again, a little more depth on some of the issues that are arising in our states. So, we first started by just trying to look at the literature and some of the best research that has been done on this issue in recent years. And one of the first things you kind of start with is the fact that automakers are investing in big time in electric vehicles. Almost all of the global automakers have made announcements about huge investments in electrified vehicles over the next few years. While we've seen some early introductions of EVs, and we tend to sort of judge the market by what we see today, what you really need to be thinking about is what's coming. And we know that there's lots of additional models of EVs coming, and lots of additional numbers of those vehicles coming in the coming years. There's, of course, a range of forecasts out there that try to predict how many EVs there will be in the marketplace in the coming years. This graph just shows you some examples of the range of forecasts that are out there. What I think our finding is that regardless of which forecast you use, there's going to be some pretty rapid growth over the coming years. And of course, those forecasts are, excuse me, those forecasts will be dependent in part on the policies and the practices that we engage in. This graph shows that they're based on some forecasts for the electric sector. There's some key opportunities for the electricity sector, in particular based on the new load growth that you can expect from all these EVs plugging into the grid, and the increased revenues for the sector that would result. Now, this slide, it's from a study in Illinois, showed that if you manage that load well, in other words, by encouraging that most of that charging happens during off-peak times, the net revenues from all that load growth can be really significant, with the opportunity to drive down rates for all ratepayers. Higher yet I mean, those revenues will be higher yet if the EV penetration rates are even higher, suggesting that the benefits to all ratepayers are yet higher if we have more EVs on the grid. So more EVs are a good thing, it appears. Now, this is, of course, important to understand as we consider the roles that utilities might play in the transition to EVs. For example, investing in EV infrastructure within their service territories, or designing rates that help encourage off-peak charging, or even perhaps, as we heard earlier, helping to utilize excess renewable generation during other times of day. So to put it another way, to not engage in supporting the EV market or actively manage how and when EVs are charging means potentially leaving very significant economic benefits and grid benefits on the table. Now this graph also shows that, of course, one of the other reasons that people are interested in EVs and why we're doing it is that they're much cleaner compared to gasoline vehicles. And this graph is based on some work that GPI did, looking at the well-to-wheels sort of life cycle emissions related to gasoline versus electric vehicles. And what it clearly shows is that EVs have, roughly half or less the emissions of a gasoline car based on today's grid. Of course, the little bar on the far right shows that if you charge an EV with all renewable power, you have a fraction of the emissions related to, compared to a gasoline vehicle. So there's a lot of potential here to decarbonize the transportation sector, clearly. Electricity is also cheaper for the EV driver in terms of operation. We know the vehicle costs tend to be a little higher, but those costs are coming down. But to operate these vehicles, to plug in and utilize electricity is in almost all cases cheaper, if not significantly cheaper than gasoline, fueling with gasoline. And of course, you can also tell from this graph, electricity prices tend to be quite a bit more stable, less volatile than gasoline prices, which clearly has some clear advantages as well. Now, one of the other findings of our report was that the Midcontinent region, unfortunately, is lagging behind other areas in some other areas of the country in some areas. We don't have as much electric vehicle charging infrastructure as some other regions that have taken more of a leadership role in this or have a more well-developed EV market, in part due to policies that those regions have enacted. We looked at a variety of studies. One that has gotten a lot of attention is the one by the National Renewable Energy Lab that looked at developed a national study on essentially how much charging infrastructure outside of the home is really needed to support the electric vehicle market and to give EV drivers the confidence that they need, that they can get to where they need to go, despite the fact that most charging is still going to happen at home at night. I think my other panelists will talk a little bit more about this infrastructure gap, so I won't go into too much more depth on this one. And I think in addition to, I think the obvious finding that utilities do have a key role to play in this area, utilities are starting to lead the way here in the Midwest region. And I'll just have a few examples, and again, we hear some other examples later, but in Ohio, the AEP has the first approved EV program in our region with about a $10 million investment. This is in the Columbus area. It's somewhat of an outgrowth of their Smart Columbus effort. And they as well as the two recently proposed EV programs in Michigan, are all based on kind of a rebate model where the utility will provide rebates to residential customers, commercial customers, and other potential hosts of highway fast charging stations. And the rebates will help to build out the infrastructure where they're needed in target segments. There are also several dockets, I know, several of the commissions that around the region have been exploring this issue in depth, and we expect more EV filings to be coming out as early as this fall. And in addition to the obvious or the benefits that I mentioned earlier of two utilities in terms of reduced costs for electricity customers and also the opportunity to flatten load curves, I should also mention that utilities are well poised also to play a role in educating not only their customers but consumers at large about EVs because of their large customer base and the fact that they would be the entity that most of them would engage with in terms of if they were owning an EV, how do they charge it? How are they going to fuel on a daily basis? So we are very supportive of the fact, or we acknowledge that the utilities have a key role in that education space as well. Is that the last one? Oh, skipped one there. So I mentioned that part of the goal of this white paper was really to develop these key principles for utility programs going forward, and most of them sort of draw on some of these findings that I've just been talking about, so I'm not going to repeat all of those here, but let me mention the last point on here, which has to do with the fact that the nature of transportation is changing today as we see new forms of mobility coming into the market, shared and connected, and services that offer the potential for people to skip the private automobile or to increasingly use these other forms of mobility as an alternative are coming onto the market. Of course, a lot of attention on autonomous vehicles and what role they might play. The point here, though, is that these new forms of mobility that are catching a lot of attention also, interestingly, are a key opportunity for electrification. The benefits of electricity or of electric vehicles are even higher the more miles that you can put on a car. And so many of these new forms of transportation allow vehicles, instead of operating maybe an hour a day, to run closer to 24/7. And so the benefits of having those lower fuel costs associated with driving become that much more significant and pay off in a big way. So I think another finding that was important here was that utilities also are well poised to partner with some of these new market entrants to try to figure out what the best charging solutions are to facilitate these new modes of transportation as well. So I think we have a link to this report that folks can go to explore more details about what our findings and conclusions were, and I'll pass it on now to Michael. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. It's truly a pleasure to be here today with Jill and Charles and Kevin. It's a terrific panel, and I've been in the EV space since 2012 when Tesla had only the Roadster. There were no superchargers. There were no DC fast chargers east of the Mississippi. I'd be at meetings generally on the coasts talking about what is an EV, level 1 charging, level 2 charging, DC charging, go real basics, real fundamental nuts and bolts education. And we've come such a long way. The report that Charles just discussed is just the latest example of absolutely phenomenal work that's being done. The research in there is fascinating, and it's really exciting. As I was listening to some of the phrases that have been talked about today and yesterday, I just jotted a couple of the key ones down. Decarbonization, electrification, the white paper, distribution systems, planning, cost effectiveness, collaboration, technology, and time is of the essence. And all of those words really do boil down to what we're here to talk about today, because as much as we want to decarbonize and the economy and electrify transportation, which is what Kevin and I really focus our efforts on, and the companies that we represent are solely focused on bringing charging to vehicles. Without all of these other, but it's so critical because without charging, people aren't going to buy vehicles. The number one impediment to people purchasing electric vehicles is a lack of charging infrastructure. So with that, let's move on to a couple slides. I'm here today representing the Alliance for Transportation Electrification. The Alliance is a broad and diverse coalition advocating for the acceleration of transportation electrification across America. Our executive director is Phil Jones. Phil is a former commissioner from the state of Washington and a past president of NARUC, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissions. He sends his regrets that he couldn't be here today, but I'm happy to be here in his place. The Alliance takes a big tent collaborative approach, recognizing that EV charging is a complex undertaking. It requires an ecosystem, all of the above approach from a wide range of stakeholders. So our members include utilities, EV service providers, which are charging suppliers, automakers, domestic trade associations, engineering, procurement, and construction firms, and standards setting organizations. We are always welcoming more and more into the fold. So if your organizations are not currently members, we'd love to have that conversation with you. The opportunities before us, as I just described, are a large and growing EV charging infrastructure gap. And there's also a lack of consistent standards, and this lack of standards makes building out the infrastructure that much more difficult. There's also widely varying interests by regulators and utilities, and so leadership and investment are essential. So I always love pulling up the latest data on EV sales. It's bookmarked in my browser, and it's something that I go to frequently because it keeps changing, and the story just keeps getting better. That chart, each color there represents years dating back to 2012 or 2013. And so you'll see the numbers on the far left of each of the calendar months are very low. So picking May, the black bar on the left, very small back in, I can't see what year is the earliest here, 2010, so very few EVs being sold. You just look at year over year, the growth in May, and that yellow line, that's the latest data available, just leaps and bounds above the same month the year before. And what's really interesting is that the number of vehicles, while growing, it's still modest. There are going to be dozens of both plug-in and fully electric vehicles released in the months and years to come. And these numbers are going to be dwarfed. These yellow lines are going to start to look like those black lines before you know it. Now you might think, all right, well, that's great. But where exactly is this happening? It's probably happening in California, maybe a couple other places that have some really great credits or benefits or HOV privileges, something like that. So I looked at the data for this part of the country. So I know these states may not be a perfect representation of the states represented by the Midwest ISO, but I believe that's a excellent it covers almost all of them. And what we're seeing is 23% compound annual growth. So it's really significant. I mean, that's a big, big number. And again, you see 15, 16, and 17 there, both plug-in hybrids and fully electrics. And fully electrics are growing by an even faster rate than plug-in hybrids. So it's a very encouraging signal for a part of the country that is not customarily considered to be on the cutting edge of electric vehicles, but the data shows really rapid growth. So in order to serve these vehicles and all the ones that are to come, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to get charging infrastructure out there on the ground to encourage more and more people to buy electric vehicles? The Alliance's strategy is, like I said before, cooperation and sharing of experiences and best practices among a wide group of stakeholders, with a focus on developing regulatory frameworks, because utilities obviously are in a very regulated space, to promote facilitation or ownership by utilities, and that's a really important factor. So for a number of years, I was with a privately owned, it was a publicly traded company, but it was a private company, building out EV charging infrastructure, and I built dozens of stations primarily in the East, and my colleagues were in other parts of the country building out regional networks. Today, there's 1,000 chargers in that one network alone, so we've made a lot of progress. But what we have seen, unfortunately, is that it's an extremely challenging business model for most private companies. Now, there are some niches and there are some perspectives in the charging world. Kevin's going to talk about one in particular, that hardware manufacturers, they sell hardware, they sell software as a service. That's a discrete model. Some companies have been able to be successful with that. But in terms of building and then owning and operating and maintaining and servicing broad networks of lots of different types of chargers in lots of different environments is an extremely challenging business model financially for the private sector, because private investors require faster and higher returns than most of the market can supply today. But that's exactly what utilities are for. That's why there are public utilities, because there's a societal need for an asset or a resource that the private sector can't necessarily step in and provide. And so that's why utilities are such a great fit for EV charging. So the key components of our broad approach are, like I said, an ecosystem, all of the above approach. Level 2 charging, DC fast charging, all part of a utility profile, similar to one of the comments earlier this afternoon about an IRP. Someone looks at a holistic need for a market and figures out what's best for that particular area. This is not a one-size-fits-all approach. We don't look at just one type of vehicle. Passenger vehicles, at the home, at the workplace, in multifamily communities, living downtown, curbside charging, medium and heavy-duty trucks, buses, ports, on-road applications, off-road applications. There's a lot to tackle here. I say this not because I want you to think that this is too much to take on, but because I want you to appreciate the magnitude and how it takes the resources of a large, sophisticated company with significant financial backing to take this on successfully. Why? Well, I got ahead of myself on the slide, just because the capital costs are so high and it really requires utility investment, especially these early days. Now, there can be innovative rate-making approaches to incentivize utilities to take this on. It's right within their core competency, and it's a very logical extension of their business. It touches on everything that we talk about in so many different environments: smart charging, demand response, distributed energy resources, a more efficient utilization of the distribution network. What we want to do is promote interoperability and open standards, and make sure that any investments that are made by utilities are made prudently and protect the ratepayer dollar. Just a moment here to talk about what a good investment it is. And this is a slide from California. It shows, it could not be more clear that EVs and EVSEs, by extension, EVSE is EV service equipment, or charging hardware, essentially. It's cost effective for drivers, utilities, and all customers. There's just a huge a huge block on that graph that shows the net benefit to all customers. And this looks at a bunch of different scenarios. So you might ask, well, Michael, how did you get that net benefit for everyone? Did you have to have like some very creative rate that's not going to work in our service territory maybe, or under some structure that our customers might not like? Well, the study shows that there's a net benefit under every scenario. It's just a matter of how big the benefit's going to be. And encouragingly, we're seeing activity all across the country. I just have a couple states picked out here, not because they're particularly representative. There are so many all over the place, including right here in our backyard, but New York, California, Oregon, Maryland. Maryland is $104 million in investment applications pending before it right now, and that's a very small state. And utilities, it's a wide range of utilities. So, of course, California utilities have definitely been on the vanguard, but Southern Company, DTE, Excel, Consumers, some of these utilities right here in this part of the country, for example, Consumers had a very effective proposal under which the company will be allowed to rate base the rebates that they're providing to customers for charging infrastructure. And that's exactly the kind of regulatory treatment that the utilities are going to need in order to put in their best efforts. And with that, I'll turn the table over to Kevin.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to present. Today you've heard a lot of really thoughtful presentations and a lot of really wonderful panels. One might say the best of panels. But as Charles mentioned, this is the last panel, and I am in the even more dangerous position of being the last of the last. So I'm going to try to be quick, brief, pithy, to the point. There might even be an animation in one of these slides, I'm not going to lie. So I'll try and keep it going. I'll speed through the presentations, and what I will do is ask your indulgence to make an assumption with me that we've gone beyond the question of whether transportation is going to be electrified, and this could be an opportunity to start to think about how, which is the much more meaningful and critical question to look at, as well as some of those other important 5 W's questions. All right. So ChargePoint is the nation's largest EV charging network. We have 52,000 charging spots in our network, and by and large, none of those are owned by ChargePoint. ChargePoint is a Silicon Valley company, but our stations are all independently owned and operated. So they're locally owned within any given state. ChargePoint was founded about 10 years ago, and we design, sell, and manufacture EV charging stations, level 2 and DC fast chargers. And then we also provide the networked servicing tools to allow independent site hosts to operate those stations themselves. All right, so I'll be hopefully not the first or the last to mention a paradigm shift today, but thinking about how EV charging is changing the way that folks refuel. They're refueling at home, at work, around town, and out of town, and I did promise that animation. So it's really going to take a new charging ecosystem. Folks are refueling their vehicles when they arrive at their destination as opposed to on their way to it, which teases out a lot of the interesting value propositions that folks have spoken to before throughout the day, thinking about how do we activate all these new types of folks in the fueling ecosystem beyond just the gas station, but also including gas station operators, to also include destination locations, workplaces, residential locations, both single family and multifamily. This whole new ecosystem where a lot more load is going to take place. How do we make sure that we are bringing them in and activate and understand their interests? Because if we fail to do that, we'll leave a lot of value on the table of folks who might be interested in investing in EV charging. So how are EVs being charged? Historically, we've looked and seen about 60% of charging taking place at home, and 30% of charging takes place at work, which is really great because most of the time you're not driving at any of those locations, you're sitting there. And your car can be doing a lot of interesting activities, and the chargers, if they've got smarts in them, like a lot of connected, networked, smart charging stations can do, as well as some smarts in some more advanced vehicles nowadays. You can manage that charging to take place in a manner that's beneficial to the grid. It's important to note that, that workplace charging has an interesting added benefit of accelerating adoption in and of itself. If an employee has EV charging at work, they're more than 6 times as likely to drive an EV just by having that charging there. So again, folks are driving when they arrive at their destinations, not on their way to them. But fast charging, direct current fast charging, is having a market impact on the way in which that behavior can take place. So as we see more and more range being capable of these vehicles, and we see faster and faster charging, our recent fast charging platform called Express Plus can go from 62.5 kilowatts to 500 kilowatts. So that'll get you a fast charge, but that'll also pose different types of challenges and opportunities for regulators and utilities. Another thing that's going to critically impact the way that electrification takes place and its value proposition is, as Charles noted, as we look beyond just personal vehicles, how we're looking at transportation as a service. We see increased transportation networking, shared mobility. What types of delivery opportunities are there for that last mile, and how can we get the most benefit out of that? Public transit, trains are great to electrify, but now we can electrify a whole lot more. And the future modes, this is where some of that innovation can really come into place. Thinking about electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicles, Jetsons cars, as well as electric planes, ferries, everything that can be electrified, I believe should be. And then how do we harness that as we start to change transportation? So a quick point on how all of these different use profiles, these use cases for EV charging, will have a different value proposition for the grid. It's going to vary and can serve a whole host of different functions. So looking first at the blue line, if you can see it, that's a typical, this is data that's been aggregated over and normalized for a 24-hour period, looking at 3 different charging profiles. So the blue represents a typical fleet EV charging profile, where you'll see vehicles coming back in the afternoon hours and charging there, and that can serve a range of different types of values, both for demand response and frequency regulation. Looking at the green, this is data that's taken off of, I believe, San Diego Gas and Electric service territory in California, where you see a giant spike in that residential charging. That's taking place because after 11 p.m. in SDG&E service territory, it's real cheap to charge. That's a great opportunity. This longer dwell time provides the opportunity to shape load management. So even before we get to the idea of pulling energy back onto the grid, there's a lot of opportunity for doing V1G vehicle grid load management so that you can shape that driving and charging behavior. That can pose a challenge, though, if you have significant adoption. If you don't ramp that up over time, you can have some challenges to consider also. The interesting load curve in orange, at least from this angle, is workplace charging. That has that high peak when folks first come in, and a mini bump peak towards the middle of the day. There's a lot of interesting opportunities there for folks to manage that load, both at the regulator and utility level, but also for the independent site hosts themselves, or even the drivers themselves, to manage this charging behavior. So to that end, I think it's important to think about, how do we activate some of those interests that I teased up in this new charging ecosystem? EV drivers want to make sure that they have availability of charging, and they want to be able to know that they've got it in real time. Can I see whether the charging station at work is free right now? If there's someone there, can I get myself in a virtual queue for it? For site hosts, they want to have minimal oversight, limited administrative requirements, and a seamless transaction. And they also want to be able to influence utilization. And for utilities, there's a whole host of interests that they could have. Load management, being a key piece. How do we manage grid benefits here? And what's important to note is that all of these interests can be met regardless of who owns the infrastructure itself. When you have smart connected stations, those can be that load management capability can be authorized and granted regardless of who actually has ownership of the equipment. So for utility engagement, I'd say ultimately it's extremely important, and we need to make sure that we're encouraging many greater roles for utilities to support EV charging. What I'd also say is that these utility investments can help to accelerate EV charging opportunities while also encouraging grid benefits. But it's important to look at the different models that do exist and ensure that they can work alongside a sustainable competitive market where those innovations that we heard of on the last panel can continue to exist, and you can still make sure that you're taking advantage of the whole host of benefits. So if we're trying to get at this, if we're trying to say we've already talked about weather, we like the idea of electrification, we like the idea of being able to shape charging to take place, to soak up the new duck curve and have this flexible load, what questions should we be asking ourselves? And there's if you're looking at just who owns the infrastructure, you're missing the important detail. And so I think the key to focus on is when we're thinking about how do we make sure that we, as a region, as regulators, as utilities, as site hosts, as folks who want to be engaged in transportation electrification, we need to look at some of these key questions around how are these stations operating. So there's a whole bunch of questions there, and I think that we don't have to go through all of them, but I'd posit that it's really important to look at what part of this is a competitive service and what isn't. There's a number of states in which EV charging is regulated as a utility service. So if you're providing EV charging and you're setting a price on a per kilowatt hour basis, you're a regulated utility. In other states, about half the states in the nation now, that isn't the case. That's a key question to think through. Two other key questions have to do with the operation of the station. Who is selecting the hardware and software that's going to be deployed at a given location? There's so many different types of charging technology. There's so many different use cases. And as we've heard on the panel already, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. So how do we make sure that even as we're starting to leverage the benefits of having utility involvement to manage this increasing load and to accelerate and support the adoption of beneficial electrification technologies, that we're doing so in a way that allows for flexibility? And then also, what are the price signals that are being set to the driver and who sets them? Price for EV charging site hosts isn't being used as a means solely to recover the costs of the investment. It's not just about that return on investment directly from each driver. Price is used as a signal to incentivize charging behavior. So some of our site hosts at destination locations will set an hour or two of free charging, and then they'll set a price signal to get someone to move along, opening up access to the asset and having more predictable load. We talked a little bit about different business models. There's a lot of colors and pictures on this. All this is to say is that there's a lot of different ways in which a utility can invest in the direct deployment. Already glossing over the incredibly important rate design roles that a utility can play. But in all of these, no matter which option is picked, you can still have those critical customer choice in different equipment and services, and you can still have an EV charging site host set pricing to the driver, regardless of who owns the station. And there's plenty of great examples of that happening. And I'd point to a few of these examples here, a few in California. We've had some interesting filings recently in National Grid in Rhode Island. We've got two filings that were already referred to by Charles in Michigan, but a number of programs have already been approved that are up there on the bottom. And when it comes to thinking about what are some of our best practices here, how do we make sure we're having a robust dialogue and allowing for regulatory clarity? Where's that site host choice in the charging station and the network, and how can they set pricing to driver so that you can maintain that healthy market competition? Are you collecting data? Are you allowing for demand response? And are we ensuring that these investments will lead to widespread benefits, both in terms of benefits to the grid, as well as in terms of access to the clean transportation itself? So I think I'm probably over time, so I'll try and stick the landing and say thank you for letting me go last.
All right, we'll open it to any question and answer.
Anybody have their hand up? Not seeing.
If not, I'll start us off. So all of you mentioned different utility programs that have been tried to enhance EV adoption within the areas. What do you believe is the most effective or most interesting utility program that you have looked into?
The most.
How do I pick between my favorite children? I don't have that
I
problem.
was thinking
yet.
the same thing.
Yeah, I only have one kid, so he's my favorite. So when it comes to utility programs, I think again, it's a really important question because there are so many different utilities that are either developing or have proposed or have received approval for, and more importantly, there are a lot of jurisdictions that are currently considering how do I even consider what's good about a utility program? Does this fall into, as New Jersey was considering for a while, my existing energy efficiency and distributed generation model, or do I have to come up with a new framework to think about how am I balancing these benefits and how am I balancing potential market impact to ensure that, as I pointed to in my remarks, that you're meeting some of those underlying operational issues so that even as we support the advancement of this market that can create great benefits, that it also doesn't put its thumb overtly on the scale. So to that end, I think that you could point to great programs around the country. The two that are before the Michigan Public Service Commission are really exciting. I know that there's a lot going on in Minnesota. One recently that comes to mind is in Pennsylvania. Duquesne Light Company has a small but mighty proposal that was built around first a set of guiding principles, touching on what's the way in which we can support the market without picking winners and losers? How do we allow a whole host of different folks to participate? So I think that's a key.
And I would say it's a great question. And I agree with Kevin also that there are so many programs out there. It's really hard to pick a best. But what I would say what I would suggest is that an attribute of successful programs is collaboration and inclusiveness and investing a lot of time in advance as programs are being developed, bringing all the stakeholders into the room and having a open, transparent process where everybody gets to express their priorities, and even if not everyone's priorities end up being included in the end, at least hopefully they are addressed through the process, and the end product is something that everybody can live with.
And I would like to add a little bit too. I think one of the responses I would make is that we're in that early experimentation phase. People are trying to figure this out. There's not necessarily one best model that everyone has agreed to for how to do this right. And I actually liked Miles' comment on the last panel about how you think about a new sort of market opportunity, sort of think about this 3 to 5 year timeline, and you try to set up some conditions to let that market evolve and then let it play out and see what innovation arises. I kind of feel like that's the phase that we're in now, and that to try to overthink how to do it right now in terms of like this is the model, or to or to fixate too much on getting it right out of the box is probably wrong. That's why a lot of these initial programs are really being called appropriately so pilots. So the intent should be to get some learning out there, to make sure that we're requiring some measurement and metrics of program success, so that we can all talk about that again in a collaborative way, hopefully over the coming years, so that we can refine our approaches going forward. I know I'll just give one sort of example of something that I think some folks are sort of talking about and trying to struggle around what are the best approaches, and that would be multifamily housing. I think we've kind of heard a couple times today, most people charge at home, right? Well, that works great. Your single family home with a garage or driveway where you get the charger conveniently located next to your car where you park. But not everybody lives in that kind of situation. I suspect some of you in the room might live in a more of a multifamily environment where you have to get another key player, this property owner or property management company, to agree to give you access to some kind of charging opportunity, which they're not always interested in doing. It's an added cost and hassle for them. And so how do we motivate that particular set of players to install charging infrastructure to enable this market? You know, some of the program experimentation going on out there is looking at, whether this is a case where sort of having a utility sort of turnkey option might actually be the best way to motivate that, versus sort of letting the marketplace sort of encourage players to come forward and develop their own proposals. So I think this is just one area where we need to sort of think hard about allowing some experimentation to go on and try to learn from it.
So
Great.
I just had a quick question about utility investments in the infrastructure and what might occur otherwise versus where the ratepayer funded programs come into place. And so I think, as commissions, we don't want to incent something or pay for something that's going to happen anyway. And so have you seen commissions wrestle with that and say, above this certain baseline, we're going to start to fund things, or are they just trying to get stuff off the ground?
It's a great question. I've not seen a commission not struggle with it. California is a really good example of an answer to that question. So a number of years ago, around 2012, around that time frame, California took a position just like you suggested, which was to prohibit utilities from investing in EV charging infrastructure. I mean, just outright prohibit, on the theory that the private sector will step up. I mean, in California, of all places, you would think that that would be the most logical place for the private sector to step in. And years passed, and a number of companies did make a good go of it, but ultimately were unsuccessful. And so California realized that it's just not going to work at this early stage. And this is a long lead time investment. This isn't like something that's going to change in 3 to 5 years or even 10 years. The average age of a passenger vehicle in this country is 11 years old. So vehicles are out there for a long time. We sell 17 million passenger vehicles a year, but they're on the road for around 20 years. So we're only turning over the fleet at 5% a year approximately. And the private sector just requires a much faster and much higher return on their investment. So California did a 180 and ordered their major utilities to invest in EV charging infrastructure. And it goes back to the pretty widely accepted premise that people won't buy electric vehicles without EV chargers out there.
I think that I'm largely in line with the gist of where that was going. I think it's incredibly important to have stakeholders involved, and I think California has some interesting examples we can learn from, and some other states also do as well. First off, I'd say though that it's really important, and appreciate the question, Commissioner, that for site hosts to have skin in the game, one way or the other. You need to have some kind of investment to ensure that you're putting stations where they need to go, and that you're not putting investments where they might not otherwise be used. We've seen a lot of examples of that going awry back during the stimulus, the ERA bill under the Obama administration, of having some different EV charging programs that either fully subsidized or just about fully subsidized infrastructure. Those programs were largely unsuccessful, whereas ones that required matching payments and having some investment led to more sustainable deployment. Also, that just at a base level stretches the value of the dollar and makes sure that you're taking advantage of dollars that could go into the market again, because we're not looking solely at locations that are requiring to get that full ROI based off of the provision of charging services. They're using it to offer an ancillary service. But even in the case where you are having ownership, you can still, or a full cost recovery, you can still have some investment on the part of the site host. A proposal settlement that's before the Rhode Island Public Utility Commission, which we're a signatory to, would have DC fast chargers that are owned and operated by National Grid, but there would be a participation payment that would be required by the site host. And also the site host would have choice in what's deployed. So you can still have all the characteristics of that competitive market. You can still require investment, but that right balance is really important. We've seen in California and in some other states some criteria that utility commissions will consider, which is, to what extent is this proposal that I have before me maximizing benefits to ratepayers and minimizing costs to ratepayers, in addition to some of the other pieces I mentioned. So I think these considerations can and should be at the forefront, and there's great examples of how that's being done right now.
I completely agree with everything Kevin just said.
Charles had referenced the notion that it's kind of Wild West, we really don't know, and to me that environment promotes entrepreneurship. That's kind of one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is you can take early steps. What are early steps, no regret steps that you can take and should take in the right places that preserve this Wild West that promotes entrepreneurship?
Well, yeah, I'm sure my fellow panelists will have more to say, but I think the first thing obviously is to get in the game and to try some stuff. What I think most of these pilot programs that are cropping up here in the Midwest are, I think, along those lines. They're relatively small programs between $5 and $15 million to create some initial investment in this space and to target some sectors that stakeholders agree are needed. So, I already mentioned the multifamily housing segment. We know that people need to charge at home. The second best place that most people agree needs charging infrastructure to help support the case for an EV is at the workplace, where people park for long periods of time. That can double your range as a commuter, and it can provide a lot of added value, not only to the driver, but also to the grid, and under certain circumstances. The other area where I think everyone agrees is where we need infrastructure is on the highway corridors, especially as we see more of the longer range EVs coming onto the market. This is the 200 plus range. People are going to want to take those on trips now because they can drive a few hours before having to have to charge again. And so, but when they get that far away from home, they definitely need to be able to charge. And so that is where I think there's pretty universal agreement. We need more infrastructure. There are a couple of other pots of money out there from the VW settlement case that are providing some of those funds. And so one of, at least the approaches that we've been taking in Michigan, and I think is true elsewhere, is let's try to leverage those funds along with some additional funding from utility programs to make sure that we cover our major highway corridors within our states. So those are three areas that I would focus on.
I'll give an answer in threes too, because that's the catchiest way to do it. So first, from a regulatory perspective, I'd say a pain-free step would be starting the conversation of how we're going to talk about this when the first program is proposed. How do we make sure that we're not then caught chasing our tail to talk about how we're going to talk about it when it's time to talk about it. Let's talk about that first. Let's figure out, is there a framework? How would I even evaluate something before I have to look at it? So that can be a really valuable process. Another piece, if we're looking beyond dipping a toe in the water, could be looking at what types of rate design needs are there for the different use cases. I understand that in many cases there can be a lack of appetite to do rate design for specific technologies. But I'd posit that while you wouldn't make an electricity rate for a toaster, an EV poses a much more potential burden and opportunity for the grid, right? Plugging an EV into your house is like plugging almost a house into your house. So this is a significant value. So if we're thinking about the longer term charging, do we need TOU rates? Do we need to look at what are our metering requirements? Do you need to have a separate utility meter at each EV charger, or do you want to start to rely on things like the embedded metering capabilities in a smart charger or in another type of technology to allow you to do a virtual TOU rate or to do off-bill financing to incentivize that charging? And the last piece has nothing to do with utility regulation, but it's extremely meaningful, and it does the same job that a utility program in EV charging deployment would do. And that is EV-ready building code requirements. How can we make sure that when we're building new buildings, that any parking that comes with them has all the conduit and wiring that would allow the future installation of EV chargers without having to dig up the same spot again? So there are many municipalities and states that have put in requirements that a certain percentage of parking spots have to have all that conduit and wiring in place so that you don't have to then go in with a big program to do that work after the fact by retrofit.
Yeah, one of the really interesting things about EV charging is that it brings together so many different skill sets from a policy and real-world perspective. Not to suggest that policy isn't the real world, obviously. I would never do such a thing in this room. But you start to look at building codes, like Kevin just described, but then you also think about like how are buildings going to be marketed? What's the use case for the building? It's going to be an office building, an apartment building, condo. There are different considerations to take into play when you look at who's the target market in terms of demographics, how many vehicles are going to be in the building, how far are people who live in that building typically going to drive. Are they renting? Are they owning? Are the spaces leased? Are the spaces owned? I mean, there's so many different factors when it comes to multifamily. But also, from a Public Utility Commission perspective, we have to take into consideration factors that we might not necessarily have had to look at before, like air quality. Most states are like very kind of siloed. You've got the air quality offices, and you've got the energy offices, and you get the Public Service Commission, which is typically looked at much more traditionally structured, like regulated companies that do one very narrow service, deliver electricity to like outlets, essentially. But now we're talking about customers like handling equipment to fill up their vehicles with electricity. And then you look at all the clean air benefits that arise from electrifying transportation. I mean, it's just indisputable that the air will be cleaner, and so that has great financial benefits to society by reducing asthma and all kinds of other pollution. So these are factors that have to be taken into consideration when most of the country, at the state and local levels at least, is moving toward a cleaner air future. So public service commissions, I would say, would be well advised to look at the mandate that their governor is directing the state overall and what's going on regionally, and what can the utility commission do to help. The traditional measures may be too rigid at the beginning when the future looks clear, but it's hard to predict with the kind of 100% certainty that we normally require when utility applications are reviewed. So I wouldn't say it's a leap of faith. I mean, this is a prerequisite. Infrastructure is the threshold requirement for people to drive electric vehicles. Without infrastructure and without a lot of it, people aren't going to buy electric vehicles. So being up here in the top of this building here, you look out around us at all the parking lots and all the garages. They all need EV chargers. even the largest utility applications are not sufficient, are not going to result in an overbuilding of infrastructure. Not even close. The billions of dollars from the Volkswagen settlement are a drop in the bucket. We're talking about building corridor DC fast charging at intervals of 70 to 120 miles. Could you imagine driving down the highway and it says like next rest area or next gas station, 110 miles? In a, you know, that would be very difficult to fathom.
Montana.
Other questions?
I have one more. So, Charles, you talked about how the Midcontinent region is lagging compared to other regions in charging infrastructure and maybe in other ways with EV adoption. But then, Michael, you mentioned EV adoption actually is a good rate within this area. With what is lagging in the Midcontinent region, what is it going to take to turn that around and get it to more the better rate of those regions that are more successful?
Maybe I'll start again. I think, you know, this MTech report focused on, again, the sort of role that utilities might play, but obviously there's other programs, including local zoning ordinances that can play an important role, as was just mentioned. Obviously, states could have incentive policies around electric vehicles. A number of states have consumer tax credits of some sort for EVs. You know, there's a lot that can be done in terms of just market awareness and education, you know, beyond the automakers themselves, and a number of organizations across the Midwest, like the Clean Cities organizations out there, have been engaged in that space, trying to raise awareness. There's you know, a number of those things that can be done, but I think it's largely true that the infrastructure gap is probably the most looming gap, or I'll posit that it's the biggest obstacle and the biggest opportunity for the utility sector now to step into. And Kevin mentioned that, you know, I think the biggest bulk of charging station installations happened with some, you know, 5-6 years ago with some federal dollars, right? So we saw a big initial investment in charging infrastructure, and then it's been, you know, more or less a trickle since then. Kevin, feel free to disagree with me on that point, but I think, you know, we had a large initial investment, and then there's, you know, the NREL study and others suggest that there's a significant gap. So I think the biggest thing that I'll just posit again, that I think the biggest thing we can do is to try to figure out how we can leverage utility dollars and the Volkswagen mitigation funds towards supporting additional investments, focusing on some of these hard to reach segments where the business case is tough, and to you know, learn from those initial investments and experiments, really, and to you know, recalibrate programs if needed going forward.
You know, outreach and education is absolutely critical. We don't rely on the thermostat companies to go out there and educate people about the need for, you know, to turn the air conditioner off at different times, like utilities, and the government goes out and promotes the importance of this device. It's very similar with EV charging. But I'll also just add quickly that the 3 questions people ask when they go to buy an EV are, how far can the car go, where do I charge, and how much does it cost to charge? So those are the 3 critical questions. If you don't have good answers to all 3 of those questions really quickly, then the customer isn't going to buy the vehicle. And if the answer to the second question is, well, there aren't really any chargers around, or there's like one over there on the other side of town, you know, the customer is not going to buy the car.
And I'll try and be super brief because I think this is the last response to the last question and the last chance that you have to, or last reason you need to listen to me before you get to go about your day. So to think about the question of what are the barriers to deployment I think it's too easy, and it would be short-sighted to just say the infrastructure. I think what we need to do if we're trying to figure out what's a good, robust solution is, well, let's get beyond just that. So what are the capital upfront cost barriers? Right? It costs more to install a station than to buy one. So how do we figure out what kind of policy mechanisms we need to address that? And then on the operating side, by and large, our electricity rates are not designed with EV charging in mind, right? The general service rates that a DC fast charger is going to go on is designed for a factory that's going to be on consistently throughout the day. So we're seeing jurisdictions throughout the country look at, well, how do we address this bridge period from a low adoption to a high adoption of EVs, and think about how should rates be structured to gradually potentially phase higher kilowatt hour charges upfront to lower, and lower demand charges to higher, to allow for the market to grow and to avoid penalizing site hosts for low utilization in the upfront year. So there are specific barriers we should target, and if we start to address some of those barriers, I think the significant growth we've seen in the EV charging market over the last 10 years will really catapult. In 2017, we had about 150,000 new EV chargers installed across the industry. There's an installed base of 500 some odd thousand chargers, and I think that as we start to address some of these key issues, we'll really be able to unlock that growth. Ultimately, the cost barriers for adoption are with the vehicle. Those are coming down with increasing battery technologies, and we see some other opportunities to address upfront vehicle costs. Predictable charging in the places where people use it, and then making sure that we can have sustainable, scalable programs that support the acceleration of the EV charging market without inadvertently trying to pick winners and losers. How do we leverage the strengths of all the stakeholders without putting our thumb on the scale? So I think it's possible to do both if we try to answer the question of how do we do it instead of just whether we do it.
Oh gosh, can I jump in with one last point so that Kevin doesn't have the last word? Okay, thank you. I guess my final thought is partly repeating a point I made earlier, which is that remember those graphs that showed the potential for new revenue growth and for net revenue earnings that can then help potentially drive down rates for customers. Think about the more that we do to facilitate EV market growth, the more that we help to drive down those rates for customers. I think of it similarly to energy efficiency programs where you want to do all the cost-effective energy efficiency you can possibly do, right? Because it's just a win-win-win all around. And if we leave on the table those potential benefits by being too coy and not encouraging utilities to really engage and to invest as long as necessary, I think, to help move the market forward until we just don't think that there's any more need for that investment, we're missing a big opportunity. So that's my last point.
I agree with Charles, but it's not an either or.
All right, I'll actually get the last word. So, Charles, Michael, Kevin, thank you for taking time and being a part of this panel, and please join me in a round of applause.
Hello, everybody. Rolf Nordstrom back again. If you've forgotten, I'm still with the Great Plains Institute. We have just 3 panels left for the day. Again, I kid. I am the bookend on our day together, and I promise to keep this brief. I think we can all agree on one thing, and that is that the most important insight from today is that while California has the duck curve, the Midcontinent now has the gray whale, which is a much more majestic energy animal, I think, by far. It's obviously impossible to recap this incredibly rich day. It's been very, very full. I hope you have found it to be an example of the kind of applied hope that Judy Greenwald suggested we all embrace, thanks to Amory Levins. We released this roadmap today, and the truth is that the world is lousy with roadmaps, right? We're just chock-a-block full of roadmaps, and that's not to disparage this one. I think it's fantastic and it's important. But it's probably important as much for who put it together and embraces it and has put it out as for what it says. And I want to leave you with just what to me were 5 important ideas from the day. I hope you have your own set in your minds or in your notes. The first one is simply that this region, one thing I think the roadmap does a great job of saying in all capital letters is that this region could achieve an 80 to 95% reduction in greenhouse gases by mid-century using supply-side technologies alone without even yet thinking about or talking about what the demand side might do, which I think Franz and others said the collaborative will be taking up in the future, along with efficiency. So that's an extraordinary conclusion just by itself, even if that were the only one. This is doable with today's technologies without any super heroic assumptions. And I think what's important about the roadmap, this is still part of Idea 1, so I'm packing a lot into Idea 1, is that the roadmap helps the region be directionally right and to help us ask the right questions along the way. Important idea number 2 for me today was that the costs of pursuing decarbonization are between 0 and very low in the near term, because it aligns with where the market is already going, and that the biggest driver of costs out to 2050 is natural gas prices, which, if I understood Evelyn right earlier, dwarf the cost of either of the decarbonization scenarios. So the 80% decarbonization scenario costs 1 to 2% more than the business as usual scenario, if I understood you right, Evelyn, and the 95% reduction in carbon emissions by 2050 is between 3 and 4% more in cost. So as somebody said, we probably have, cost is probably less the issue than time, which I'll come back to in a minute. Important idea number 3, which I think is really valuable going forward, is the consensus principles at the back of that roadmap document being as or more important than, again, the content of the roadmap itself. And important because those consensus principles can offer a framework for future action that will help us, again, be directionally right as we're making decisions between now and 2050, kind of ask ourselves the right questions. Important idea number 4 is that the goals and actions of utilities in this region are already aligned with the pathways outlined in this roadmap, at least in the near term, which means that we're already directionally right, which is good news. We have a lot of momentum. And the 5th important idea is simply that time is of the essence. We're not necessarily behind, but we have much to do. And I think the roadmap and the process that led to it, I think, demonstrates that one of the things, not the only thing, but one of the things that can accelerate progress beyond historical norms is the kind of joint problem solving that was made possible by different interests coming together, coming to agree on a common set of facts, traveling a learning curve together, and coming out with a shared vision for what could happen between now and mid-century, and having some joint consideration for how best to act. So with that, I want to again thank all of our speakers today who were generous with their time and experience and expertise. I want to thank my GPI colleagues, again, for making today possible. Huge amount of work led to this event. A special shout out to Franz Litz, who you heard from earlier, overview of the roadmap, who has really ably led this process. And another thank you to the members of the Midcontinent Power Sector Collaborative itself, for demonstrating the power of diverse interests charting the future together. Thank you all for coming, spending the day with us. I hope your brains are full, if not overflowing. Stay tuned for future roadmap editions on the electrification of transportation and buildings. This last panel was just a tease. It was longer than a trailer typically is for a movie, but it was just a tease nonetheless. Travel safe. Thanks for coming.